At exactly 7:54 on a cool Monday morning, the marble lobby of Brooks Global Holdings looked exactly the way business magazines love to photograph it. Towering glass walls reflected the skyline. Executives crossed the polished floor carrying coffee and laptops, while soft piano music drifted through the atrium. Then Naomi Brooks stepped through the revolving doors alone. She wore dark jeans, white sneakers, and a charcoal jacket over a simple black shirt. A slim leather portfolio rested beneath her arm. No designer handbag, no expensive jewelry, no security escort, no assistant announcing her arrival. That was intentional. 6 minutes. That was the promise she had made to herself before leaving home. 6 minutes to discover whether the company she had spent 23 years building still practiced the values printed across every annual report. Behind the reception desk, Daniel Mercer looked up with a professional smile. "Good morning. How may I help you?" "Good morning," Naomi replied warmly. "I am here for the board meeting." Daniel paused. His eyes drifted from her face to her clothes before returning to the computer. "May I have your name, please?" "Naomi Brooks." His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a second before he slowly slid a visitor form across the counter. "Please have a seat while we verify that." Naomi accepted the clipboard without argument. Of course. She walked toward the waiting area and sat quietly beneath the company logo. Less than 30 seconds later, the revolving doors turned again. A white man about 50 years old entered wearing faded jeans, a lightweight jacket, and carrying only a tablet. Daniel immediately stood with a broad smile. "Morning, Mr. Bennett. Conference room is ready for you upstairs. The executive elevators are waiting." "Thank you," the man replied before walking straight toward the private elevators. No visitor form. No request for identification. No verification. Naomi watched him disappear behind the closing elevator doors before lowering her eyes to the clipboard resting in her hands. She quietly folded the blank visitor form in half and placed it inside her portfolio. Daniel looked over from the reception desk. "It should not take long if everything checks out." Naomi smiled politely. "I am sure it will." Around the lobby, employees continued moving through the building as though nothing unusual had happened. A few glanced toward Naomi before quickly looking away. Others simply assumed she was another visitor hoping to meet someone important. None of them asked her name. None of them wondered why she seemed completely at ease. Daniel looked toward her once more. "Are you comfortable waiting?" Naomi nodded. Waiting has a way of answering questions people never think to ask. The unexpected reply lingered in Daniel's mind even after he turned back to his computer. Moments later, 3 senior executives stepped out of a nearby elevator discussing quarterly projections. Richard Collins, chief operations officer, noticed Naomi sitting quietly beneath the company logo. He looked at Daniel. "Is she waiting for someone?" Daniel shrugged. "She says she is here for the board meeting." Richard glanced toward Naomi for barely 2 seconds before replying. "Keep the executive floor clear until someone confirms her appointment. We cannot afford confusion this morning." Naomi heard every word without changing her expression. She looked up at the large digital clock above the reception desk. 7:55. 5 minutes remained. She had not learned a single name, but she had already learned exactly why she had come. The digital clock above the reception desk shifted from 7:55 to 7:56, and the marble lobby settled back into its polished rhythm. Employees crossed the floor with practiced confidence, while elevators carried executives toward the upper levels where the quarterly board meeting would begin in only a few minutes. Naomi Brooks remained exactly where Daniel Mercer had asked her to wait. Her leather portfolio rested across her lap. She never reached for her phone. She never checked the time more than once. She simply observed. Years earlier, she had learned that silence often encouraged people to reveal far more about themselves than conversation ever could. Daniel glanced toward her every few moments. Something about the woman bothered him. Most visitors who believed they had been treated unfairly complained almost immediately. Some demanded supervisors. Others insisted someone important was expecting them. Naomi did none of those things. She simply waited with a quiet confidence that refused to disappear. Daniel leaned toward another receptionist and lowered his voice. "She is still here." His coworker Claire looked across the lobby. "Maybe she really has a meeting." Daniel shook his head. If she did, someone upstairs would already be here. Across the lobby, a large digital display rotated through company advertisements. Smiling employees volunteered in local schools. Engineers celebrated new product launches. A bold slogan appeared across the screen. People first always. Naomi looked at the words for several silent seconds before lowering her eyes again. Promises were easy to display. Living them required something much harder. At exactly 7:57, the executive elevators opened once more. Melissa Grant, Executive Vice President of Corporate Strategy, stepped into the lobby carrying a tablet while speaking with two directors. Daniel greeted her immediately. "Good morning, Ms. Grant." Melissa acknowledged him before noticing Naomi. She slowed only slightly. "Is everything all right here?" Daniel nodded. "A visitor claims she is attending the board meeting." Melissa studied Naomi from head to toe. Her clothes looked practical rather than expensive. The leather portfolio appeared well used. Nothing about her suggested the image Melissa associated with executive leadership. She offered a courteous smile that never reached her eyes. "Board meetings are invitation only." "I understand," Naomi replied calmly. Melissa waited for an explanation that never came. Instead, Naomi simply returned the smile. The silence seemed to irritate Melissa more than disagreement would have. "Someone will let you know if there has been a misunderstanding," she said before walking toward the elevators. As the doors closed behind her, two younger managers exchanged quiet remarks. One whispered, "She must have the wrong building." The other smiled. "Or the wrong floor." Neither comment was loud enough to draw attention, but both reached Naomi clearly. She showed no reaction. Another minute passed. A maintenance technician pushing a supply cart entered through a side corridor. Daniel greeted him warmly by name and asked about his family before waving him through without hesitation. Naomi noticed the effortless kindness. Respect came naturally when people recognized someone. It became conditional only when they believed they were free to make assumptions. She glanced toward the clock again. 3 minutes remained. Somewhere above, the lobby directors prepared for the most important meeting of the quarter, completely unaware that the first evaluation of the morning had already begun several floors below. Around 7:58, the lobby no longer felt like the calm entrance of a successful corporation. It had quietly become a place where assumptions spread faster than facts. Naomi Brooks remained seated beneath the company logo while executives and employees continued passing by with only brief, curious glances. Each person seemed to decide who she was before considering the possibility that they might be wrong. Richard Collins returned from a phone call and stopped beside the reception desk. He looked toward Naomi for barely 2 seconds before speaking to Daniel. "Has anyone confirmed her meeting yet?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet." Richard nodded as though the answer settled everything. "Then keep the executive floor clear. We cannot have unauthorized visitors wandering upstairs this close to the board meeting." Naomi heard every word but kept her attention on the digital clock. 2 minutes remained. Daniel reached beneath the reception desk and picked up the internal phone. "Building security, this is reception. Could someone stop by the executive lobby for a routine verification?" "Thank you." He hung up and looked relieved, as though procedure itself had removed any need for further thought. Less than a minute later, Michael Reeves, the senior security supervisor, stepped out of a nearby corridor. He carried himself with calm professionalism rather than intimidation. "Morning, Daniel. What seems to be the issue?" Daniel nodded toward Naomi. "She says she is here for the board meeting, but we have not been able to verify her appointment." Michael turned toward Naomi with a polite smile. "Good morning, ma'am. May I ask who you are meeting today?" Naomi looked up. "The board." Michael waited for another name. None came. "Do you happen to have the name of the executive expecting you?" Naomi answered gently. "They will know when I arrive." Michael frowned only slightly. It was an unusual answer, but not an aggressive one. Before he could continue, Richard stepped closer. "We have already spent several minutes on this. If there is no confirmation, she should wait outside the executive area until someone claims her." Michael looked back at Naomi. She had remained respectful from the moment he arrived. She had not argued. She had not demanded special treatment. She simply waited with remarkable patience. Something about that patience made him uncomfortable. Across the lobby, 2 finance managers slowed as they passed. One quietly asked, "Is she interviewing for something?" The other shrugged. "Maybe she thinks confidence can replace clearance." They continued walking before either man realized Naomi had heard every word. Michael spoke again. "Ma'am, would you mind showing me any meeting confirmation you may have received?" Naomi smiled kindly. "I could. But before I do, may I ask you one question?" "Of course." "If I were wearing an expensive suit and walked in with a leather briefcase and a driver waiting outside, would you still need to verify who I am?" Michael did not answer immediately. Richard answered for him. "Appearance has nothing to do with it." Naomi met his eyes. Then why was the gentleman before me welcomed upstairs without being asked a single question? Silence settled across the reception area. Daniel looked away. Richard folded his arms. Michael slowly glanced toward the executive elevators where the casually dressed white executive had disappeared only minutes earlier. For the first time that morning, he realized he had never actually seen anyone verify that man's identity either. 2 minutes remained. The second hand reached 7:59, and an uneasy silence settled over the lobby. No one announced it, yet almost everyone sensed something unusual unfolding. Naomi Brooks remained seated with effortless composure, while Michael Reeves stood a few feet away, uncertain whether he was handling a routine security check or something far more important. Richard Collins, however, showed no hesitation. He looked at Michael and spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to having every instruction followed immediately. "We have already delayed this long enough. Escort her to the public lobby until someone verifies her story." Michael did not move. "So she has been cooperative the entire time." Richard sighed impatiently. "Cooperation is not authorization." Naomi slowly rose from her chair for the first time that morning. She picked up her portfolio and adjusted the sleeve of her jacket. There was no frustration in her face, only the quiet dignity of someone who refused to let another person's assumptions define her. Michael met her eyes. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience. I am only trying to follow procedure." Naomi gave him a warm nod. "I know. That is why I appreciate the way you have spoken to me." Richard checked his watch. "We are done here. Michael, please." Before Michael could answer, another voice broke the silence. "Wait." Everyone turned toward the sound. Ethan Walker hurried across the marble floor, holding his company tablet tightly against his chest. His breathing was uneven from rushing, but his eyes never left Naomi. Richard frowned. "Ethan, this does not concern you." Ethan stopped beside Michael and looked directly at Richard. "I think it does, sir." Richard folded his arms. "Explain." Ethan unlocked the tablet and opened the executive leadership directory. "I was reviewing the board agenda because something did not make sense. The meeting chair listed here is Naomi Brooks." He turned the screen toward Richard. "Then I opened the executive directory. The profile photo is different, but I am almost certain this is the same person." Richard barely looked at the screen before handing the tablet back. "You are new here, Ethan. Do not mistake a resemblance for proof." Ethan refused to lower the tablet. "Sir, I really think we should verify her identity before asking her to leave." Michael looked at the profile, then back at Naomi. He could see enough similarity to make him hesitate. Daniel shifted uncomfortably behind the reception desk. Richard noticed the hesitation spreading through the group, and his voice became noticeably firmer. "We cannot stop operations every time someone claims to recognize a visitor. Michael, escort her outside." "That is my decision." Naomi quietly watched the exchange. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Reeves, may I ask you one thing before you decide?" Michael nodded. "Of course." Naomi looked toward the large digital clock above the reception desk. "How much time until the board meeting officially begins?" Michael glanced upward. "About 1 minute." Naomi smiled softly. "Then perhaps we should allow 1 minute for certainty instead of acting on assumptions." Richard shook his head. "We are finished waiting." He stepped forward and looked directly at Naomi. "If you truly belong here, someone important will come looking for you." Naomi held his gaze without the slightest trace of anger. "Yes," she replied. "They will." She looked once more at the clock as the display changed from 7:59 to 8:00. The board meeting had officially begun. The digital clock changed to 8:00, and for a brief moment nothing happened. The lobby continued exactly as before. Phones rang softly. Employees crossed the marble floor. Elevator doors opened and closed. Richard glanced at Naomi with a faint smile. "It looks like nobody is expecting you after all." Naomi simply nodded. "Sometimes the truth takes a moment to arrive." Richard looked at Michael. "I think we have waited long enough." Michael hesitated. He had handled hundreds of security incidents during his career, yet this situation felt strangely different. The woman standing before him had remained calm, respectful, and completely consistent from the moment she arrived. She had never tried to force her way upstairs. She had never claimed special treatment. Before Michael could respond, Naomi reached into her jacket pocket and removed her phone. She selected a single contact and quietly placed the call. "Good morning, Angela. Protocol 0. Main lobby. Please proceed." "Thank you." She ended the call less than 10 seconds later and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Richard smiled politely. I hope whoever you called can clear this up. Naomi returned the smile. So do I. 20 seconds passed. Nothing changed. Richard relaxed and folded his arms. Daniel returned to his computer, believing the situation was finally over. Even Ethan began wondering whether he had misunderstood what he had seen in the executive directory. Then Michael's security radio crackled. Supervisor Reeves, maintain your current position. Do not escort the guest from the executive lobby. Executive administration is on the way. Repeat. Do not remove the guest. Michael frowned. Copy that. Richard immediately looked at him. Who was that? Executive command, Michael answered quietly. They instructed me to leave her exactly where she is. Richard forced a small laugh. Probably someone trying to avoid another complaint. Before anyone replied, every executive phone in the lobby vibrated almost simultaneously. Melissa checked her screen first. Executive board session initiated. Immediate attendance required. Richard unlocked his phone and saw the same notification. That is odd, he muttered. Daniel suddenly looked up as the reception monitors refreshed without warning. The normal company homepage disappeared, replaced by a secure message. Executive governance protocol active. Please await further instruction. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. During orientation, he had learned that only one person in Brooks Global Holdings possessed the authority to activate executive governance protocol. He slowly lifted his eyes toward Naomi. She stood exactly where she had been all morning, her expression unchanged. Across the lobby, conversations faded as more employees noticed something unusual happening. Nobody understood why. They only sensed that the atmosphere inside the building had shifted. A soft electronic chime echoed through the marble atrium. The private executive elevator began descending from the top floor without anyone pressing the call button. 23, 22, 21. The illuminated numbers continued moving steadily downward. No one spoke. For the first time that morning, Richard stopped looking at Naomi as though she were an inconvenience and started looking at her as though she might know something everyone else did not. The private elevator reached the lobby and came to a smooth stop. A quiet chime echoed through the atrium before the doors slowly opened. Angela Foster stepped out first, followed by the General Counsel, the Chief Human Resources Officer, and 4 members of the Board of Directors. Their expressions were calm and focused. None of them looked surprised. None of them asked questions. They walked directly across the marble floor toward Naomi. Richard instinctively straightened his jacket. Daniel stepped away from the reception desk, expecting the delegation to pass by. Instead, Angela stopped in front of Naomi and smiled warmly. Good morning, Ms. Brooks. The board is assembled and waiting whenever you are ready. One by one, the directors greeted her with effortless respect. Good morning, Madam Chair. Good morning, Naomi. We are ready. The entire lobby fell silent. Richard stared at Naomi, unable to hide the shock on his face. Daniel slowly looked from the directors to the woman he had asked to complete a visitor form only minutes earlier. Claire lowered her eyes while Ethan quietly exhaled with relief. Michael took one respectful step backward, clearing the path to the executive elevators. Angela noticed the folded visitor form resting inside Naomi's portfolio. She smiled faintly, but said nothing. The paper spoke for itself. Richard finally broke the silence. Ms. Brooks, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. Naomi turned toward him with the same calm expression she had worn since entering the building. No, Richard. There has not. She paused for a moment before continuing. I did not come here to see who recognized me. I came here to see how this company treated someone it believed had no authority. Her eyes moved slowly across the lobby. No one asked why I was here. No one verified my appointment. Decisions were made before facts were gathered. That is not a policy problem. It is a leadership problem. Richard lowered his head. If we had known. Naomi gently interrupted him. Respect should never begin after recognition. It should begin the moment another person walks through the door. She turned toward Michael. Thank you for remaining professional even when you were under pressure. Michael nodded respectfully. Thank you, ma'am. Naomi then looked at Ethan. And thank you for asking for verification instead of accepting assumptions. Ethan smiled nervously. I almost stayed quiet. Naomi returned a small smile. But you did not. That made all the difference. Angela stepped forward. Ms. Brooks, Legal Human Resources, and the board are prepared to begin the executive culture review. Naomi looked once around the silent lobby, then gave a single nod. Good. Let us begin. No one spoke as Naomi turned toward the executive elevators. She had taken only 2 steps before Richard found his voice again. Ms. Brooks, please. May I explain? Naomi stopped, but did not turn around immediately. After a brief pause, she faced him once more. You may explain during the review, Richard. Not before it. Richard took a slow breath. I was trying to protect the executive floor. Naomi nodded. I believe you. He looked surprised. You do. I do. She answered calmly. Protecting the company is part of your responsibility. The question is how you decided who required protection from whom. Richard had no answer. Naomi continued. You never asked my name. You never checked the visitor schedule. You never verified the board agenda. You reached a conclusion before gathering a single fact. That is not leadership. That is judgment without verification. The words landed harder than any accusation. Naomi then turned toward Daniel. When I arrived, you greeted me politely. Thank you for that. But somewhere between my first sentence and your second decision, you stopped seeing a guest and started seeing a problem. Daniel lowered his eyes. You are right. I should have verified first. Naomi gave a slight nod. Verification protects everyone, including the person making the decision. She looked toward Claire, who still stood frozen behind the reception desk. Claire quietly spoke before anyone prompted her. I judged your appearance before I considered your words. I am sorry. Naomi studied her for a moment. I appreciate the apology. What matters now is whether today changes the next person who walks through these doors. Around the lobby, employees listened without moving. No raised voices. No humiliation. Only quiet accountability. Angela stepped beside Naomi and handed her a slim folder. Inside were printed copies of the security timeline along with notes prepared by Legal and Human Resources. Naomi closed the folder without reading it. I have already seen everything I needed to see. Angela nodded. The board requested that all participants join the review immediately. Naomi looked toward Ethan. Would you join us for the first portion of the meeting? Ethan blinked in surprise. Me? Yes. Naomi replied. You witnessed the same events from a different position. Honest observations matter more than impressive titles. Ethan glanced nervously toward Richard before answering. I would be honored. Naomi smiled. Thank you. She then looked at Michael. Mr. Reeves, please ask your team to welcome every visitor exactly the same way for the rest of today. Michael answered without hesitation. Consider it done, ma'am. Finally, Naomi turned back toward the reception desk. Another visitor had just entered through the revolving doors carrying a worn backpack and a stack of documents. Before anyone else could react, Naomi looked at Claire and asked one simple question. Who is our next guest? Claire took a steady breath, stepped forward with a genuine smile, and greeted the man. Good morning, sir. Welcome to Brooks Global Holdings. My name is Claire. How may I help you today? Naomi watched quietly for a single moment, then nodded to herself. Without another word, she entered the private elevator beside the board of directors, knowing the real culture review had already begun long before anyone took a seat in the boardroom. The boardroom overlooking the city was already silent when Naomi entered. Every director stood as she walked toward the head of the long walnut table. She acknowledged them with a brief nod before taking her seat. Please, everyone, sit. There is no celebration today, only work. The directors settled into their chairs while Angela distributed folders marked Executive Culture Review. Richard, Daniel, Claire, Ethan, and Michael entered a moment later. Unlike the board members, they remained standing until Naomi invited them to sit. Thank you for coming, Naomi said. I know this has been an uncomfortable morning. Richard spoke first. Ms. Brooks, before we begin, I want to apologize for my conduct. Naomi looked at him calmly. I accept your apology, Richard. But this meeting is not about apologies. It is about understanding how a leadership team reached conclusions without evidence. She opened the folder in front of her. At 7:54, I entered the building. Within 30 seconds, I was categorized as a visitor who required verification. At no point did anyone verify the identity of the executive who entered after me, even though he was dressed just as casually. She paused. Can anyone explain why? Silence filled the room. Finally, Daniel answered. I believed I recognized Mr. Collins. Naomi nodded. Recognition is a useful tool. It is not a substitute for process. She turned another page. Richard, you instructed security to remove me before confirming whether I belonged in the building. Why? Richard lowered his eyes. I thought I was protecting executive operations. Naomi replied quietly. Protection built on assumption eventually becomes discrimination, even when that was never the intention. The room fell silent again. Naomi looked toward Michael. "Mr. Reeves, what made you hesitate?" Michael answered honestly. "You never behaved like someone trying to enter without permission. You stayed calm. You answered respectfully. Something did not feel right." Naomi smiled faintly. "You trusted observation instead of pressure. That matters." She then turned toward Ethan. "Why did you decide to speak?" Ethan took a deep breath. "Because I realized I would remember staying silent longer than I would remember being embarrassed." Several directors exchanged approving glances. Naomi nodded. "Courage is rarely comfortable. That is why it is valuable." She closed the folder and folded her hands. "Let me be clear. This review is not about finding villains. None of you woke up intending to mistreat a stranger today. The real danger is far more ordinary. It is the habit of believing first impressions without asking one more question. That habit costs companies talented employees, loyal customers, and public trust every single day." She looked around the table, making eye contact with each person. "Leadership is not measured by how we treat people whose titles we already know. It is measured by how we treat people whose stories we have not yet heard." Angela quietly placed another document before the board. Naomi continued. "Effective immediately, I am ordering a full review of our visitor procedures, executive training, and leadership evaluation standards. Every recommendation will be based on evidence gathered today, not emotion. We will correct the system before we judge the individuals." Around the table, heads slowly nodded. The conversation that followed would shape company policy for years to come, but everyone present already understood the most important lesson had not been written inside any report. It had walked through the front doors wearing jeans, white sneakers, and carrying nothing except quiet confidence. 3 months later, the lobby looked almost exactly the same, yet everything important had changed. The marble floors still reflected the morning sunlight. The glass walls still overlooked the city skyline. Employees still hurried toward meetings carrying coffee and laptops. But every visitor was now greeted before being questioned. Every appointment was verified before assumptions were made. Respect had quietly become the first step instead of the final reward. Following the executive culture review, the board approved a series of leadership reforms based on evidence rather than emotion. Visitor procedures were redesigned. Executive evaluations now measured judgment, professionalism, and accountability alongside financial performance. Richard Collins accepted responsibility for his decisions during the investigation and resigned after the board completed its review. Daniel Mercer remained with the company after additional leadership training. He often reminded new reception staff that the first responsibility of a professional was to understand before deciding. Claire volunteered to help train every new receptionist because she never wanted another visitor to experience what Naomi had experienced that morning. Michael Reeves was promoted after the board recognized the professionalism he had shown under pressure. Ethan Walker joined the Executive Leadership Development Program, not because he had recognized the chairwoman, but because he had been willing to question an assumption when everyone else accepted it. One Monday morning, an elderly woman carrying a worn folder stepped into the lobby, wearing inexpensive clothes and comfortable walking shoes. Claire immediately walked around the reception desk with a genuine smile. "Good morning, ma'am. Welcome to Brooks Global Holdings. My name is Claire. How may I help you today?" The woman smiled with visible relief and explained that she was there for a scholarship interview for her granddaughter. Claire confirmed the appointment, then personally escorted her to the waiting area and offered her a cup of coffee while she waited. A few moments later, Naomi entered through the revolving doors wearing another simple jacket and carrying the same leather portfolio. She quietly watched the interaction without interrupting. Angela joined her and smiled. "Looks like your 6-minute visit changed more than a policy." Naomi looked across the lobby where every visitor was being welcomed with the same courtesy regardless of appearance. She nodded gently. "Policies tell people what to do. Culture is what they choose to do when nobody reminds them." Without another word, she stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, she caught one final glimpse of the reception desk, where another visitor was being greeted with the same warmth and dignity as everyone else. This time, no one needed to know who owned the company. Everyone simply treated another human being with respect.